Hello, and welcome to Day by Day True Crime Stories, the podcast where we explore a different crime or justice milestone from this day in history. I'm your host, Kona Gallagher, and today is May 4th. On this day in 1970, a student protest at Kent State University ended in tragedy when members of the Ohio National Guard opened fire on unarmed demonstrators. In just 13 seconds, 4 students were killed and 9 others were wounded. Today, we're going to talk about the shocking moment that rocked the nation and forever changed how Americans viewed civil unrest, the Vietnam War, and government's response to peaceful protest. Let's get started. To understand how this happened, we have to go back to April 30th, 1970. President Richard Nixon had just announced that American forces were expanding the Vietnam War into Cambodia. For many, this felt like a betrayal. Nixon had campaigned on ending the war, and now it seemed like he was escalating it. Across the country, protests erupted, particularly on college campuses. Located in the quiet town of Kent, Ohio, Kent State wasn't a center of radicalism, but like many universities at the time, it did have an active student protest scene. On May 1st, students gathered on the campus commons to protest Nixon's announcement. That night, tension spilled over into downtown Kent. Bonfires were lit, bottles were thrown, and windows were smashed. Local police struggled to contain the situation. The next night, May 2nd, the campus ROTC building was set on fire during a protest. Firefighters who arrived to battle the blaze had their hoses cut by demonstrators. It was clear the unrest was escalating. That evening, the Ohio National Guard was called in to restore order. Troops arrived that night and took up positions on campus. On Sunday, May 3rd, Ohio Governor James Rhodes came to Kent and held a fiery press conference. With the primary election just days away, Rhodes took a hardline stance. He labeled the student protesters as worse than brown shirts, which referred to Nazi paramilitaries, and he vowed to use every means available to drive the protesters out. Shockingly, his speech inflamed tensions rather than cooling them. Despite a campus-wide ban on protests, another demonstration was planned for Monday, May 4th. Students were determined to voice their opposition to the war, and now to the military presence on their campus. The weather on Monday, May 4th was sunny and mild. Around noon, roughly 2,000 people gathered on the commons. Some were protesters, but others were just curious onlookers. Members of the Ohio National Guard, equipped with rifles and bayonets, lined up across from them on the hillside known as Blanket Hill. The Guard ordered the crowd to disperse. Some students responded with chants and signs. Others, simply watching between classes, stayed put. Guardsmen fired tear gas into the crowd, but wind blew much of it back on them. A few students threw rocks, but most of the crowd remained distant. They were defiant, but nonviolent. Around 12:20 p.m., roughly 100 guardsmen began advancing with fixed bayonets, pushing the students over Blanket Hill and toward a parking lot near Taylor Hall. The protesters scattered. After a brief standoff in the parking lot, the guard began retreating up the hill, and many believed that the confrontation was over. But then, without warning, 28 guardsmen turned and opened fire. For 13 seconds, rifle shots rang out. Students screamed and dove for cover. It was not a warning volley. The guard fired directly into the crowd. Between 61 and 67 shots were fired, and when the smoke cleared, 4 students lay dead. Those lost that day were Jeffrey Miller, 20, who was shot through the mouth. He died instantly. Allison Cross, 19. She was hit in the chest and died shortly afterward. William Schroeder, 19, was an ROTC member who wasn't actively protesting. He was shot in the back. Sandra Schuer, 20, was walking to class when a bullet pierced her neck. None of them were closer than 265 feet from the guardsmen who fired. 9 others were wounded. One, Dean Caller, was left paralyzed for life after a bullet shattered his spine. Another person was nearly 750 feet away when they were struck. The violence of that day was captured in a haunting photograph. 14-year-old Marianne Vecchio kneeling over Jeffrey Miller's body, arms raised in horror. The image, taken by Kent State photojournalism student John Philo, made front pages and eventually won him a Pulitzer Prize. As the immediate chaos subsided, a few faculty members stepped in to prevent more violence. Geology professor Glenn Frank stood between angry students and the guard, pleading with students to disperse, saying, quote, "I don't care whether you've never listened to anyone before in your lives. I am begging you right now. If you don't disperse, they're going to move in and it can only be a slaughter." End quote. Students did listen, and his emotional appeal likely saved more lives. President Nixon called the deaths tragic, but his comment that, quote, "when dissent turns to violence, it invites tragedy," struck many as placing blame on the students. The nation was divided. Some mourned the loss and questioned the guards' actions, while others saw the students as agitators who brought it on themselves. Within days, campuses across the country erupted. Over 4 million students participated in strikes, shutting down nearly 450 colleges and universities. It was the largest student protest in U.S. history. But just 10 days after Kent State, police shot and killed 2 black students at Jackson State College in Mississippi during another protest. The FBI investigated the Kent State shooting, and President Nixon formed the Scranton Commission to examine campus unrest. The commission's final report called the shootings, quote, "unnecessary, unwarranted, and inexcusable," end quote. Despite this, early efforts at legal accountability failed. A state grand jury focused on charging student protesters rather than the guardsmen. Eventually, in 1974, 8 guardsmen were indicted on federal civil rights charges. None were convicted. A judge ruled that prosecutors hadn't proven willful intent to deprive the students of their rights. Victims and their families pursued a civil suit. That too ended with no damages awarded, until 1979 when the case was retried. The state of Ohio settled, paying $675,000 total and issuing a statement expressing deep regret but no admission of guilt. The statement said in part, quote, "In retrospect, the tragedy of May 4th, 1970 should not have occurred. Better ways must be found to deal with such a confrontation." End quote. It was the closest thing to an apology any of the families received. Now, one of the enduring mysteries of this is whether or not the guard had been ordered to fire. The official story claimed that soldiers acted out of fear for their own safety, but later analysis of an audio recording captured by student Terry Strub suggested otherwise. Decades later, the tape was enhanced, and when it was, some listeners claimed to hear a command, quote, "Right here, get set, point, fire," end quote. The FBI reviewed the tape, but found it inconclusive. No one was ever prosecuted for issuing such an order. The Kent State shootings exposed the growing disconnect between America's youth and the government, and really showed the risks of militarized responses to civil dissent. In the years after May 4th, 1970, police and military forces increasingly adopted less lethal methods for crowd control, such as rubber bullets and riot gear, hoping to avoid ever repeating such a tragedy. The image of soldiers firing military rifles at college students became a cautionary image for the nation. In the years since, Kent State has honored the memory of the victims. The campus holds annual memorials. In 2010, the shooting site was added to the National Register of Historic Places. In 2016, it became a National Historic Landmark. Neil Young's song Ohio, recorded shortly after the shooting, captured the national mood. The lyrics, "4 dead in Ohio," became the symbol of a generation's loss of innocence. The victims were not radicals. They were students. Some were protesting. Some were just walking to class. They paid the ultimate price for being in the wrong place at the wrong time in a moment when fear and force replaced dialogue and restraint. Now, more than half a century later, the 4 dead in Ohio still call out to us to value dialogue over division and peace over violence. The legacy of May 4th, 1970 continues to endure in the hearts of those who lived it, in the history books, and in the hope that such a day will never again be repeated. Thank you for joining me on today's episode of Day by Day True Crime Stories. If you found today's story compelling, please subscribe, rate, and review this podcast. It'll really help us grow. And be sure to join me again tomorrow as we explore another significant event in true crime history. Until then, stay safe and remember that behind every headline is a life worth remembering. Day by Day, True Crime Stories is a Little Monster production.
Hey, you can do it!